Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Whale Nerds podcast. This is episode 149, and my name is Katlyn, and I am back from the Southern Ocean and wanted to share a little bit about my time down in Antarctica. Before I do that, though, I do want to take a moment to thank you all for listening to the podcast all these years. I think this is now year 6. Yeah, January of 2019, and now we're in 2025. Time flies when you're podcasting about whales. So thank you all that have been here at any point from the beginning, from whenever you started. We're always happy to have you, happy to hear that you want to learn about whales. And especially thank you to those of you that continue to support us on Patreon. That really does make a huge difference for us to be able to continue to put on the podcast because it is not free. But the support we get on Patreon is a big help. And also thank you to the Safina Center who supported me for the last 3 years, partially for the podcast, but partially also for a book that I put out at the end of last year. And it's been really nice to have their support for the last 3 years as well. If you're looking for ways to help the podcast, the easiest way to do it is share it with others. Other than listening to it, just tell your friends about it. Leave a review that encourages people to listen to it. Anything like that helps. You can always check out what we're doing on our website, thewhalenerds.com, or on our Patreon, which is at Whale Nerds. We also have Facebook and Instagram, and all of our podcast episodes are available on YouTube from episode 100 onwards as well. So I worked for about 7 weeks down in Antarctica this season. It was really short and sweet. I was kind of gambling with my availability a little bit, but still ended up getting down there for 3 trips with Oceanwide, working on Plancius, which is the smallest of their vessels. It takes about 100 people, and um, it's a little ship and it's a rolly ship, but it's also super quiet. And has some really good viewing decks. That's one of the things I really like about Plancius is that you can walk all the way around the vessel pretty easily. So if you do see something really cool, you can kind of follow the sighting all around the ship. It's one of my biggest pet peeves to get on an expedition ship and you can't walk all the way around the deck on one level. So yeah, Plancius has that as a platform, and I really like that about it. So I headed down to Ushuaia. All the trips we worked will go out of Ushuaia for Oceanwide. And our first trip that I was on for the season was a charter. So it wasn't like regular folks that sign up for an Antarctic trip. It was a group that had chartered the whole vessel. And it was actually a group of people that were marathon runners. It was not like your typical Antarctic trip, which I have some mixed feelings about. I think Antarctica is worthy of more than just being a venue for a marathon. But at the same time, it was a really interesting group of people. And like, it is kind of like that last frontier, I guess. You know, everybody says like Alaska's the last frontier. Uh, but like Antarctica is the place where like you would not think to run a marathon. And the group that does this, they run marathons in all the major deserts of the world. Well, Antarctica is technically a desert. It's a white desert. It's covered in snow and ice, but it generally has really low precipitation. So it is a desert. It just comes with a different set of challenges. And so it was interesting to kind of see this group operate and like what it all meant for them and like what we could do as guides to like support them. But basically, like the long and short of what they were doing is we would pick a site every day that we could be at for at least half the day and set up a circuit for them to run that would have minimal disturbance on wildlife. So these people were running in circles in the snow for hours. And sometimes, since it was fairly early in the season, you know, it's the end of November, first week of December, not all the ships are down running trips yet. sometimes at the last minute we could book the whole day. So there were several places where they ran 9 to 12 hours in circuits, which was that was gnarly. Like I don't think I could ever do that. But I was really impressed with our expedition leader being able to find sites that were like that we could pull off this event and have minimal disturbance to wildlife and still give them a circuit that was at least 1.5 to 2 kilometers long. Some places we got circuits almost 5 kilometers long. And so we didn't go to a ton of places during the trip because it was more about getting the mileage in for the racers. And over the course of 5 days, one person ran 250 kilometers in snow and ice, and one day in snow and gravel with a nasty headwind. Really, I mean, pretty impressive. Um, so within the group of marathon runners was also people that came to support their runner, that were along for the trip as like a plus one or just a 1 day runner. And then there was also a tour group that the group leader had done the marathon before. And so uh, she brought a group of just like regular travelers to fill some of the seats, and it like worked out good for everybody. And so we did have a small group of people that we would guide every day, and our guide ratio to guests was like huge. So we basically would just get in the field with them, like we'd get the marathon started for the day and like get them set up with what they needed. And then we would just be supporting them with like the logistics throughout the day, like water and stuff like that. And then we would just take the other group like out on a guided tour of Antarctica. Um, which was pretty incredible. Like the first day, a lot of people all ran, like even though single day runners, it was the first day. So there was like four guides that were free for like 12 people. And we just were like, let's go walk to look at some penguins and let's go walk to look at some seals. And like it was actually really cool to be able to give like a private tour of Antarctica to those people. And it's again fairly early in the season, end of November, beginning of December, but there were already quite a few humpback whales around the peninsula and around the South Shetland Islands, and so that was nice to see. We had some really nice encounters, and there's kind of like three like highlights, I guess, from that trip. One was seeing Arno's beaked whales really close to the ship. I kind of messed up the sighting for myself because I ran out into the bow as they were getting passed down the side of the ship, and I kind of was in a place where I either needed to run up or down the stairs to follow them. But then they all dove, so I was like, okay, I'll just like lean over the side and like watch. Um, and then when I thought they were all down on their dive, I came inside. Well, they all resurfaced and they all did their terminal breach like simultaneously. And by the time I ran back out the back door, I just saw the whitewater. And I was like, oh my God, I know out of everyone on the ship, I know better. I know that's a common beaked whale behavior that they do that terminal breach before they dive. And I didn't wait him out long enough. I should have stayed for another minute and I would have seen him and had my camera in my hand. But it was still cool to see them. It was still like really interesting. And I didn't get the greatest. We only have one cell phone video of the whole thing. I sort of have leaned towards there are no beaked whales, but other people on the ship thought they were southern bottlenose whales. Either way, they were a beaked whale species that we don't see super often in Antarctica, and there's one cell phone video of them breaching. It's on the Oceanwide Instagram feed. The bartender actually beat me to the back door and got out there in time to to see them breach. She's really good at when there's something exciting happening. There's like a sneaky passage out the back of the ship where she can see it for just a minute before she's got to run back in and do service. Um, so it was kind of a highlight moment for the trip. The ship was full of a lot of people that are not super into wildlife, so I think it was mostly just the guides that lost their minds while that was happening, but it was still really amazing regardless. But then there are two like days that really stood out to me during that trip that were like just really good days down in Antarctica. And the first one was our day at Danko Island. For me as a guide, it was an amazing day. It's like one of those days you live for as a guide. For the runners, it was not a great day. They had a really brutal track that was like a lot of switchbacks up and down. It was really steep. It was a lot of elevation gain, and the circuits were short, so they had to run a lot of laps. Um, but for us as guides, like it was kind of just a little bit misty, foggy, but it was you could tell it was going to be a sunny day. And we're looking out at the Aurora Channel and it's like the fog's starting to clear and like the sun's bursting through and just it's glass, like it's like a mirror in the Aurora Channel. And it was just the reflections were incredible. It was like it didn't seem real. Just seeing the peaks on that clear sky reflecting like a mirror off the water with icebergs floating by, and like we only had one ship pass us all day. It was just, oh, it was so beautiful. It was so amazing. And there was whales kind of swimming throughout the Aurora Channel all day. I think we had 5 or 6 different whales. And at some points in the day, like the clouds would roll in a little bit and it would try and snow, but it was still sunny. Like if you've ever, if you've ever been in like a really light rainstorm and like the sun's peeking through, but the rain's still falling, it was like that, but like snow, which was also wild. Like I was standing in just like my waders and like a wool shirt and like no jacket because it was warm and the sun was like reflecting off my dark shirt, but then it was snowing. And we ended up doing a landing in the morning with the like +1 group, and they got to go up to the penguin colony, and some of us were down just kind of supporting the race logistics throughout the morning. And we had a lot of free time, so we just hung out with the Gentoo penguins down on the shore and watched them come and go from the snowbank and the ice bank and take their baths in the ocean, and it was really fun. And there was one Gentoo penguin there that had like almost no white markings on his head, so he looked kind of funny. And it was, as most penguins are, it was really curious about all our gear and everything, so it just was standing really close to where we were at the landing site, and we could get some nice photos of the unusual markings on its head. And then in the afternoon, for the +1 folks, like once they ate lunch, the racers were still going. And so we took them on a Zodiac cruise, and there was no ice blocking the backside access of Danko Island, and it was so calm and so pretty to see that huge, like all those big glacier faces just reflecting like a mirror off the ocean. It was amazing. And we got to see whales. We had huge flocks of penguins swimming around. It was like one of those days it's just like gonna live in my brain forever. It was really pretty. Like even the racers would like stop and take a look. They are allowed to stop. Like they can't, like they're allowed to stop and have breaks for food in the bathroom and like to catch their breath and whatever. Um, and there's some other rules about like what they can and can't do when they stop, but they can also like slow down on the track and like look around. Um, but yeah, just absolutely amazing day. And then the other day that stands out to me from that trip was the day we were in Deception Island in the South Shetland Islands on our way, like our final operation day before we went back into the Drake to go back. And in the morning we were at Telephone Bay in the back of Deception, which was the conditions were horrible. It was so windy. It was like partly cloudy. It was so cold, and unfortunately the runners were like running into a headwind, and it was a really long morning because we were waiting for the person who was about to make 250 kilometers. So we wanted to let them finish. And then we had a booking for Whalers Bay in the afternoon. And so it was like kind of towards the end of the morning, like weighing how to finish the day and like if we go to Whalers or not. And I'm so glad the person finished and we got everyone on board for a quick lunch, because when we went to Whalers in the afternoon, the wind just stopped and the sun came out and beach was steaming because it was low tide. There was quite a few penguins on the beach, so the marathon runners could like actually look at a penguin for once instead of just running away from them. And I was gonna actually do a walk through the whaling station and go see if like the gulls were nesting and just go look at the buildings and stuff. And somebody called on the radio and said, "Hey, there's a couple seals on the beach down here." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I'll come check them out." And two of them were molting elephant seals, which those were my first elephant seals of the season. So I was happy to see them as two juveniles that were molting. Um, and then there was a leopard seal on the beach, and it was Chunk. I don't know if I've talked about Chunk the leopard seal before. I think I have on the Cheeseman's trip last year. I met him in Deception Island as well. He's a well-known male leopard seal that hangs out in pretty much only Deception Island. As far as I know, he has like 20 something sightings in Happy Whale, and they're all in Deception Island. And where I saw him on that trip is almost the exact same spot I saw him on the Cheeseman's trip, right at the end of the beach by the access to Neptune's window. He is called Chunk because he's missing the right hind flipper. And so he has a big chunk taken out of him. And so, depending on the angle he's laying on the beach, it's easy to see. But he's also a very like mellow leopard seal on shore. He generally ignores people and he's often napping so hard that he's snoring. I have videos of him snoring. Um, and yeah, it's just an interesting way to see a leopard seal just hauled out on this black gravel beach. He was sleeping so hard that the tide came in around him during our landing, and like once it started covering his nostrils completely, then he started to wake up and like he realized he had an audience of people that were watching him while he was waking up from his nap. So he did yawn quite a few times to be like, "Hey, I'm paying attention. Like, look how big and scary I am." And then he started like gargling the water. Like he was like making like this chomping motion with his mouth, and then like he would let some of the water into his mouth and then like splash it back out, or he would like gargle it a little bit, which was pretty funny. And then after he was like all the way woken up, he just slinked off into the water and disappeared. And that was the end of our landing anyway, so it was kind of perfect. And then the other thing that was really cool that had time to do for this trip was we made good time crossing the Drake, and so the captain took us closer to Cape Horn. You can only go within 3 nautical miles of Cape Horn unless you have a Chilean pilot on board. But we just called the Coast Guard and asked if we could come and make the 3 mile pass around Cape Horn. And that's the closest I've ever been to it, which was really awesome. And there's huge flocks of black-browed albatross out there, like hundreds and hundreds of birds in one flock. And there were also Magellanic and rockhopper penguins, and so it was really nice to see like I think it's cool when you get like really different species like that where you have like albatross flying overhead and then like there's a penguin in the water underneath them. So that was really a cool thing to see. The second trip of the season um after that was a Falkland Islands, South Georgia, Antarctica combo trip. And I only worked one of those this year, but it was the best combo trip I have ever worked. Like, if you're only going to work one for the season or ever in your life, you wanted to be on this trip. Like, it was incredible. So the first day out of Ushuaia, we picked up a Corandera pipit as a hitchhiker. It's a little land bird. I tried my hardest to keep it alive for 24 hours until we got to the Falkland Islands. We fed it snacks and we gave it water, and it seemed to, it was pooping a lot and it was really active. And then in the evening, it curled up in a dark corner on the back deck of the ship and it went to sleep. And I was like, okay, I think we're gonna be all right. We'll be within sight of land by like a reasonable time in the morning. And so I'll just go check on it in the morning and then it'll fly off. And it almost got there. At 5 a.m. or 5:30, whenever I got out on deck to do my rounds to check for birds on the deck, uh, it was still asleep and it was still in its same spot. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, we're good. And so then I did the rest of my rounds just to make sure no other birds had landed on the deck. And when I went to the back of the ship again to give him some water, he was not alive anymore. So unfortunately, he almost made it to the Falkland Islands, but not quite. Um, Other really nice sightings as we approached the Falklands. The first day there was some whales around, mostly fin whales, a few that were questionable, maybe some sei whales. So we had some good bird activity like giant petrels and Cape petrels and some other stuff. But then the morning that we approached the Falkland Islands, we were going to have our first operation out at New Island, which is the outermost island of the Falkland Islands. And you come through this area that's really narrow, and not every captain will do it. And it does depend on the weather, but we came through this passage called the Woolly Gut. So you kind of come around the backside of New Island and then weave your way through these rock formations and then appear in front of New Island Harbor. And it was beautiful. And again, I got up early to check on the birds. And as I was like watching the pipit sleep, I kept hearing this little like, and I was like, no way. I kept looking out at the water and I was like, I don't see anything. Maybe it's just the wind. And I just kept hearing it like, I was like, okay. So I like leaned out off the side of the boat a little bit and there was Commerson's dolphins swimming along the stern of the ship. They weren't even swimming on the bow. They were mostly swimming like midship and towards the stern. And I was evaded by Commerson's dolphins all last season. I went to South Georgia, the Falklands. I did Chilean fjords. I went in and out of the Beagle. I don't even know how many times. And I never saw a single Commerson's dolphin. And then there was a group of them with the ship for over an hour. So I was so glad that I got up early to do the bird check because I finally got to see Commerson's dolphins. And after they'd been with the ship for like an hour, they were joined by some Peel's dolphins. And so there was Commerson's dolphins and Peel's dolphins swimming around the ship, even bow riding together. Like the Peels would come in and bow ride, and so one Commerson's dolphin would come over and bow ride as well. And so that was awesome start to the day. We had some distant whales that I suspect were sei whales, although there were some humpbacks around as well. And of course, we saw albatross and penguins. And then when we got to New Island, it was windy and off and on it was rainy. But we had a really, really good day on New Island. It wasn't very cold. Um, I love the caretakers of the island are so nice and they're really interesting people. They've sailed around the world on their really small sailboat and lived in South Georgia on their sailboat for many years and then have been the caretakers out at New Island for quite a while. And they just the way like the kind of mindset you have to have about like life and just the way you approach everything to be able to live the life they've lived, like you have to really like you got to be really mellow but also like keep yourself entertained and keep your partner entertained and like not get sick of each other in small spaces and really isolated places. And they're just, yeah, I don't know, they're just really really interesting people. I really like hearing their stories and like just their commentary on anything. So we had a really good day out on the island with them. We went up to the colony where there's a mix of black-browed albatross and southern rockhopper penguins breeding in the same place. And so the rockhopper penguins had chicks. The albatross were still sitting on eggs. They didn't have chicks yet, but it was cool to see those two species together. And then there were also baby geese and ducks all over the island of multiple species. And I was just like, oh my God, it's so cute. I was just taking lots of pictures of ducks and geese. I was kind of like the de facto ornithologist. I wouldn't even say that. Like the bird nerd on board. Um, because we didn't have an ornithologist, so I didn't really have any lectures on birds. But at least I could like identify the main ones and like be helpful with spotting. And then we had this group of birders on board as well. Um, mostly from the East Coast of the US. There was at least one person from the West Coast. Um, and they were super helpful at just like spotting everything in general, but also were quite knowledgeable about the bird life. And so they mostly like worked as a team. And like I didn't, even though we didn't have an ornithologist on board, I didn't feel like it really hindered the experience too much for them, which was good. I did my best. In the afternoon, after we went to New Island, we went over to Saunders, which is also a place that I really like. It's a beautiful white sandy beach where you see four different species of penguins, and the Gentoo penguins and the rockhopper penguins had chicks, and we got to go out to the furthest albatross colony, which was gorgeous. The birds were flying like right over our heads, and it was a really nice afternoon. And then in the evening, we were transiting towards Stanley, which is the main port in the Falklands, and we got interrupted at dinner. The bridge was saying there were killer whales. And so we all left dinner, and I went and grabbed my camera and my binoculars, and I could see when I came out on deck, I could see blows and I could see dorsal fins, but I was like, these aren't killer whales. Um, so it turned out the bridge was really excited from a far distance. They were sei whales, and the bridge thought they were killer whales, but it was a really big group. It was like 10 to 12 sei whales, which is also unusual and very interesting to see. And the lighting was really pretty, and the sea was quite calm. So to me, it was worth it to still get interrupted for dinner, but we did have to explain to quite a few people that that was not killer whales. They were sei whales. And later in that evening, we also had another group of sei whales that was even bigger, like 20 to 25. And they were socializing and like chasing each other around and rolling around. And it was really like the best sighting of sei whales I've ever had. And so it was interesting. And also, like, I was able to get a lot of photos. And so I sent an email over to Falkland Islands Conservation, who does like the most of the mammal work, but also some other wildlife work in the Falkland Islands. And I was like, hey, we have some ID photos. These are the two sightings we had. These are the coordinates. This is like the details, whatever. And I sent them all over. And then they were like, oh, yeah, we'd love the photos. And so I sent them over for their catalog. Some of the data is public on their website and their reports. And the this first place we saw the sei whales is a known hotspot. The other place is kind of like between hotspots, but it's interesting to see the aggregation nonetheless. So that was a nice sighting for us, and it was a good opportunity to share some data with the researchers there. And then the next day we went to Port Stanley. Of course, all the usual sights in town. It's kind of the last sign of civilization before you continue the rest of your trip. We did have a few Commerson's dolphins right by the pier when we first arrived, but they disappeared pretty quickly. And then we did have some South American sea lions get on the pier before we left, so people got to see those because that's also like the last chance to see South American sea lions during the trip until we get back to the Beagle Channel. In the afternoon, when we left Stanley, again, it was so calm. Like at this point, I'm already kind of like suspicious of these people because it's been so calm. I'm like, what have you guys been doing? Like, have you been sacrificing things off the ship and we don't know about it? Like, we've had so many nice days so far. And we had really good bird action, and we had sei whales and humpback whales when we left Stanley on our way to South Georgia. As we got further offshore, we had fin whales and just like beautiful, glassy, calm seas. And then the other days while we were transiting to South Georgia, again, unbelievably calm, like such great conditions. We had hourglass dolphins throughout the whole day, and I think the only reason we saw them all was because of how calm it was. Like we probably have like there's probably that same number of hourglass dolphins out there all the time, but there are lots of times where you transit from South Georgia from Falklands to South Georgia and you never see a single one because it's usually so rough. We had a few scattered baleen whales, mostly fin whales, maybe some sei whales. But the big sighting of that transit was we saw a spectacled porpoise. Oh my God, it's like so rare. There's so few records of them. I couldn't get my camera or my brain to focus to get a photo of it as it went by the ship, but I saw it like do the kind of like slow double roll thing that like porpoises do, and the fin shape was so weird, and it some of the guests in the birding group got photos of it, and I was like 100% that is a spectacled porpoise. Unbelievable. I never thought I would see one in my life. I wish I would have got a photo, but like what can you do? Um, yeah, that was incredible. Like rarest, probably the rarest thing I've ever seen in my life was that spectacled porpoise alive swimming. Um, yeah, so cool. Uh, then as we got closer to Shag Rocks, I was like really hopeful that it wasn't going to be foggy. Unfortunately, I was wrong. So it was quite foggy as we approached Shag Rocks. We did have a really good bout of feeding humpback whales, and we got some nice bird flocks of prions and other birds, but the visibility was so bad that I think we missed quite a few sightings of other baleen whales feeding, but we did get like two or three subgroups of humpbacks that was pretty good to see from the ship, even though visibility was only like 100 yards. And then all this has already happened. We haven't even got to South Georgia yet. Like, it was such a good trip. So we got to South Georgia and we got in every single operation. That never happens. Never. We had unbelievable weather. Like, South Georgia is notorious for having horrendous weather. I mean, I've seen some of the fiercest winds I've ever seen in my life in South Georgia. And yeah, we got in, we made every single operation work. There was a few tweaks here and there, and like we kind of compromised on one morning, but like, oh man, it was just unreal. So the beginning of December is the height of fur seal breeding season. So the males have got their harems set up, the females are on shore giving birth. You're seeing sometimes you're seeing births happen, you're seeing fresh placentas, you're seeing pups with placentas still attached. You're seeing females come ashore that look like they're about to go into labor. So it's just like fur seal chaos. And there are a few elephant seals around, mostly the ones that have just weaned from their moms, but also some of the early ones coming ashore to molt. And of course, there's always king penguins year round in South Georgia because of their offset, like funny 14-month breeding cycle. There's always chicks and there's always adults. Unfortunately, we did have a new wave of bird flu start to sweep through South Georgia as we were there because it's the height of the breeding season for fur seals. It's the most stress. It's when you have the most seals on the beach and you have young seals who are immune compromised. So we did see some sick animals. We did see dead animals. Nothing too gory. We were able to kind of like skirt around areas that were like where there was quite a few carcasses, and we got there as the wave was like just starting, so like ships behind us were reporting mass mortality, and we did change a few operational sites or like the plan at a few sites to avoid the mortality that had been reported the day before we were booked for those sites. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't really know what to think about how long this is going to persist in the South because, um, animals are bringing it back and forth across the Drake. I'm really hopeful that we are not bringing it back and forth across the Drake. I think it's spreading amongst the wildlife and that tourism is not contributing to the spread, but I mean, we don't have enough science to know that for sure. Overall, I mean, the fur seal and elf seal populations are quite large and robust at this point. So unless this persists for like several more years, I don't think it's going to have that serious of an impact on the population long term. And this year, we did not see a ton of cases in elephant seals. It was mostly in fur seals. So, like, elephant seals had it last year. It seems like it spread enough that now there's some sort of immunity. This year, it's spreading more in the fur seals. So, maybe next year they'll have some sort of immunity as well. It hasn't really gotten into the penguins to any great degree. Um, but it very well could. I mean, it's a bird flu. that has been transmissible to mammals. So fingers crossed that it doesn't get into those giant king penguin colonies. And South Georgia government really this year they've changed the tactic with bird flu. So basically it's at the discretion of the expedition leader to make a landing or not if there's a mass mortality. And as long as they can stay 5 meters away from all carcasses and live animals, then they can proceed with a landing if they choose. Our expedition leader didn't want to go on sites where there was mass mortality, so that's why we did change our plan a little bit in a couple places. But overall, I don't think the guests really were too bothered by it. I mean, they were really flexible, pretty easy group of guests as well. So, where we did make landings was Right Whale Bay, Grytviken, St. Andrews Bay, Godhull, and Gold Harbor. And we ended up switching the plan to cruise at Salisbury Plain and Husvik because of bird flu. So, Salisbury Plain, we were going to land. We opted to Zodiac cruise. Husvik, you cannot really land there. I mean, you can, but you can't get close to anything exciting. We were going to land at Stromness, but there was a mass mortality reported at Stromness, and the weather wasn't very good either. But the ship in front of us even said, like, approaching the landing site, like it smelled. So we, Husvik, Stromness, and Leith are whaling stations in South Georgia that are all right next to each other. So we cruised at Husvik in the Zodiacs, which was really cool. I've never cruised there in the Zodiacs. And then we did a ship cruise of all three whaling stations back to back to back. And when we do that, I like to have there's like a guidebook with all the information about the whaling ships and all the sites in South Georgia. I like to just take that book out on deck and just read off the dates and like who owned the companies and what was the relationship between the three stations, because they do have an interesting history. I mean, they weren't all owned by the same company, but they were very physically close to each other, and so like the men would move between the stations to have some social time, especially in the winter. Like one station had a soccer pitch, one had a movie theater, and so they would kind of share around the activities to like keep the spirits up, especially in winter, because whaling was pretty ugly and hard work, and the men pretty much all came from like pretty far reaches of the northern hemisphere, and so it was a really isolating place to be. And so it was, that human dimension of like whalers were people, and like this is how they lived, is interesting. And it's also, to me, it's really cool to see the wildlife like reclaim the stations as they continue to break down over time. The only station that's been renovated is Grytviken. At this point, there may be a plan to do more of the restoration at other stations later so that people can land there and walk around them. But for now, just Grytviken has been restored. So you do get to like see a whaling station up close and personal when you go to South Georgia. And then you can see the others from the ships or the Zodiacs. And the landing I think I was most excited about, it's a tie. Um, Last year, St. Andrews Bay and Gold Harbor both closed really quickly at the beginning of the season because of the mass mortality in elephant seals. And we got to land at both this year. And both of them, the weather couldn't have been more perfect. Like the conditions at the beach were nice. The sun came out. Oh, it's just like it was too good. Like it was too good of a South Georgia trip. Um, Throughout the voyage, we had humpback whales pretty consistently from the north all the way to the south, down the leeward side of the island. We did see killer whales towards the south end of the island really briefly, um, but they were really hard to follow and like kind of going the opposite direction that we wanted to go. And then we did see quite a few leucistic or like the blonde fur seals. We saw several adults, I think at least 4 adults, 5 adults, and quite a few pups as well. So it's always nice to see one of those little golden or blonde fur seals. And we had, by the end of it, 4 different species of penguins. We had king penguins, gentoo penguins, chinstrap penguins, and macaroni penguins. And actually, during our Zodiac cruise in Cooper Bay, we saw all four species on a single beach, which is pretty cool. So, incredible South Georgia trip. And then on our way from South Georgia to Antarctica, that famous iceberg A23A was on our path. So we stopped by and took a look at that. And just like when I saw it last year, the weather was not nice and it was foggy and snowing and windy. But we did still get close enough to see it. It's still absolutely insanely massive. And when it's foggy, it's really hard to comprehend how huge it is. But the last year, the shortest side took us 5 hours to go around. This year, I mean, it's kind of in a funny shape now this year, but this year the shortest side was still 2 hours to transit around the shortest side to view it. So, yeah, seeing the infamous A23A again this year. I have a feeling as it continues to fall apart, there's going to be an epic amount of ice around South Georgia again, like there was when I think it's D30 fell apart in front of South Georgia, or another big ice sheet one. So the designation for the letters, I think I talked about this in another episode, is which ice shelf or like which area the ice came from, and then like what order of iceberg broke off that shelf that year, and then the A is like the biggest piece from the original iceberg. So A23A came from the Ronnie Filchner ice shelf, and for many, many years it was grounded in the Weddell Sea and kind of like broke free within the last few years and started moving again. So it like broke off and then was stuck again, just not part of the ice shelf. So as we got to Antarctica, we made our first approach to Elephant Island with a plan to try and check out Point Wild either from the ship or do a Zodiac cruise. Unfortunately, when we got there, the weather was not good. It actually was kind of rough during the crossing. Not horrible, but like unpleasant. It was the most unpleasant weather we'd had of the trip so far. And one morning, um, it snowed quite a bit, but like the wind was on the stern. And I looked at the ship's doctor and I was like, "Do you want to build a snowman?" And at first she laughed and I was like, "No, seriously, like we need an outside activity because like it's rough, but it's not that rough and like we're stir crazy. Like we've been on the ship for 2 days. We need to do something." So she and myself and two other guides, we went out on the bow and since we were kind of sheltered from the wind and we built snow creatures. We built a snowman, we built a whale, we built a penguin, and we built an elephant seal. And they lasted on the bow for like 4 or 5 days. But unfortunately, when we got to Point Wild that same afternoon, it was too swelly and it was foggy. So we just hung out for a little bit and then we continued cruising. We went down the Bransfield Strait and it was really, really windy. So we tried to get as far down the strait as we could into some shelter from the wind. And we had enough time in the afternoon to do a Zodiac cruise near Lindblad Cove. And we got to see Adelie penguins and chinstrap penguins and gentoo penguins. And then the next day we were like fully settled on the peninsula and we could do all of our operations. And again, just like incredible Antarctica trip. Like really good weather, amazing wildlife. Again, I don't know what these people were doing on the ship to keep all this good luck. Quite frankly, I don't want to know because it's probably something illegal. But it was just an amazing few days on the peninsula as well. So the first morning where we did like a full day of operations, we went to Portal Point, which is like your mainland Antarctica landing. There's not a lot of wildlife there, but you're on the like continent. Um, it was a really nice sunny day. There was whales as we came in the morning, and then there when we got on Portal Point, there was a bunch of fast ice in the back of Charlotte Bay, like up against the glacier and out to Portal Point. And I guess I don't know if it was broken and refrozen fast ice. So it was like a bunch of sea ice in there. And that ice was not there on our previous trip. One of the sites where the runners were doing their circus was Portal Point, and that sea ice was not there like through 2 weeks, 3 weeks before that. So it was interesting to see how it had changed. Unfortunately, the other thing that was different in Charlotte Bay for our second trip was that there were krill fishing boats in Charlotte Bay, at least five, and the ones that we saw looked Norwegian. Um, so yeah, that was a bummer to see. Like we're hanging out, having this beautiful Antarctic landing. It's a sunny day. We can see whales from shore, and then there's just the smokestacks of five different krill fishing vessels in Charlotte Bay. Um, and then just around the corner, we go around to Foyne Harbor, and there's so many whales just around the corner feeding, which also is like, okay, obviously the food's here, but like, do we need to be fishing right here when there's also a bunch of whales feeding right here? I feel like, and the krill fishing vessels are not doing anything illegal fishing in that area. That is an area they are allowed to fish. Um, and the reason why they are there and not in their usual fishing grounds is because the South Orkney Islands were locked up in ice at that point. So they normally fish up there, which also is problematic, but not illegal. And since there's too much ice up there, they came down to the peninsula, and that's like Charlotte Bay is like the little window where they can fish. So, yeah, kind of hard to see. But, anyways, in the afternoon, that same day, we went to Foyne Harbor. We had an incredible Zodiac cruise. It was glassy, calm, mirror like conditions again, and like more than 50 humpback whales feeding in the area, some of them in groups, some of them by themselves. The groups were changing all the time. Some of them were doing beautiful bubble net feeding, and the ones that were doing bubble net feeding also had huge flocks of southern fulmars following them around. It was it was so cool. It was so good. It was just like it can't be beat. And it's really hard to capture the bubble net super well from the Zodiac because you're so low to the water. That might have actually been more interesting to watch from the ship, but just like seeing the birds and like seeing the bubbles go around and hearing the whales and just being around that many whales is just, yeah, it's always magical. And the scenery, I mean, just with the mirror reflections of the ice and the mountains, you just can't beat it. And of course, we tried to beat it because in the evening we had this beautiful cruise in Wilhelmina Bay, which is just around the corner. And there was still fast ice and sea ice in Wilhelmina Bay as well, which I had never seen before. And we had heard a rumor from another ship. And like just there's kind of like some naturalist talk that goes around about like, oh, we saw an emperor penguin. So we knew there'd been a few reported around Charlotte Bay and Wilhelmina Bay off and on throughout the season. And the report from Wilhelmina Bay was pretty fresh. And so I was looking really hard and I keyed in the birders to like quietly like look as well. And I think we saw it from like 4 miles away, sitting on the fast ice in the back of Wilhelmina Bay. I was just at first it was standing and I was like, this penguin, I know we're far away, but this penguin is by itself and it looks huge. So I watched it for like 15 minutes and I felt pretty sure that it was an emperor penguin. And I went up to the birders and I was like, hey, have you guys been looking at this thing in the scope? Like, it looks really suspicious. And they were like, yeah. And I was like, I really think that it's an emperor. And so the bridge agreed to just keep going for a bit until we were sure. And then we were like, yeah, I think it's definitely it. Like once we got within like 3 miles or 2.5 miles, we were like, yeah, there's no way it's anything else. So then the bridge was able to push through like all the sea ice and get us like right up to the fast ice edge. And it was sitting, um, I don't know, a few meters in from the edge, just laying down. And so we got to see an emperor penguin on top of that already incredible day in Paradise in Portal Point and in Foyne Harbor. It's just like it's illegal at this point. And that was our ninth species of penguin for the trip, I believe. No, eighth species of penguin for the trip. So on a good South Georgia Falklands combo, you get seven. And this time we got eight because we had the emperor penguin. Just, man, I don't know how it gets any better, but it did. The next day we went to Sierra Cove, and on our way there in the middle of the night, we had a report and a sighting of killer whales, which quite a few people did get out of bed for. But some didn't. But that's okay because the next morning at Sierra Cove, during our Zodiac cruise, we also saw killer whales, which that's only the second time I've ever seen killer whales in the Zodiac in Antarctica. So just incredible. We also had loads of humpback whales in Sierra Cove. Quite a few of the Zodiac saw a leopard seal. I have a really funny video of a gentoo penguin jumping up on the same ice floe as a leopard seal and then running right back off. We had really good views of gentoo penguins there. One of the things that's really nice about Sierra Cove is if the ice allows you to get close to the base, then there's like these really good spots where the penguins come and go out of the water and they'll all like crash, like cascade into the water together. Um, and they swim around in big flocks. And yeah, it was just a great day. And then in the afternoon, we went back out the Gerlache and into the Bransfield a little bit. We went to Palaver Point, and then we went across the Bransfield to Deception Island. Palaver Point was also great. Chinstrap penguins, nice weather. But I will say it really seemed like less chinstrap penguins there this year than there was last year. And I don't know, like, I only have last season to really compare to for most sites that we go to. And so I don't know if that's just like a time of day thing or like if or my perspective. Like I didn't count them all, but like, there were parts of the colony where I was like, oh, well, there was nesting birds up there last year and now there's none. And there seems to be less nests here, especially at Palaver Point. There were a lot of spots where there was still a lot of pebbles that could have been used for nests that were just laying around. So it's not like in a colony where there's no more pebbles left and they're all stealing from each other. Like there were still pebbles around that they could have built nests out of, and there was nobody else trying to build a nest. So I don't really know. I feel like I should talk to the people that do the camera traps at different sites and see if they're noticing the same thing. But regardless, was a great landing. And then the next day for our final day, we went to Deception Island. In the morning, we went to Telephone, which much nicer weather that time around. And then in the afternoon, we went to a place called Elephant Point, which is on Livingston Island, I think. Don't quote me on that. Anyways, we went to Elephant Point in the South Shetland Islands. It was the first time I'd been there, and it was so cool. There's nesting giant petrels and like around the rocky outcrops not far from the landing site, including there was a white Nelly, which is a white morph of a southern giant petrel. Just the way the elephant seals, like how many there were and what ages there were and how many recently weaned pups there were. I think there's no notes about it in the site guidelines, but I do think that the elephant seals are breeding there again. I mean, it used to be a breeding site because that's where they hunted them. But yeah, there's just so many young, recently weaned elephant seals that I was like, there's no way you swam from South Georgia to here. Like, the ones on South Georgia don't even know how to swim yet, hardly. So, yeah, I do think they're breeding there. And then there's Gentoo penguin colonies, and they had teeny tiny chicks. It was the first, like, peninsula or South Shetland chicks we'd seen of the season. There are other nesting seabirds, but also because there's nesting birds around the rocky outcrop areas, one of the two vascular plants that exists in Antarctica is on that island. They may both be there, but we saw the one that looks more like a grass near the bird nesting colonies, which was cool. I've never like seen it good enough to like get pictures of it. So saw one of the two plants in Antarctica. Besides, there are moss and lichen and algae, but There's an actual vascular plant that looks like grass as well. Just overall, incredible trip. Really good humpback whales throughout the trip. We had more fin whales in the Drake Passage. The bird group, I think, checked off almost every single thing off their list except for like a few super rare things. But they even got like some super rare things. They got Kerguelen petrel, they got Antarctica petrel, the Corandera pipit, they got pretty much all the albatross they wanted. Yeah, I mean, just it was incredible trip. We also had killer whales in the northbound Drake, looked like type A's, and it was a huge group, like 30 or more. And we had dusky dolphins in the Beagle Channel, so we saw all the main species of dolphins. So overall, 8 species of penguins, 2 types of killer whales. We had the B's down in Antarctica. We had the A's in South Georgia and in the Drake. More humpback whales than I could possibly count, and really great looks at sei whales as well. So, I mean, overall, just cannot beat that trip. Just insane. So good. So, a turnover day for that trip into the last trip I worked of the season was Christmas. And that was a little weird to have turnover day in port be Christmas. There was no other ship on the pier besides a giant Princess Cruises ship. And like the Princess Cruises ship took up the whole pier on the one side, basically. And we, like, if you didn't know Plancius was docked on the, like, opposite side when you're looking at the pier, it blends into the side of the Princess ship so good that you can't even tell that it's there. Like, I have pictures, it's comical. Like, Plancius is just this tiny, like, it looks like a lifeboat for this cruise ship. So yeah, it just really puts it into perspective. And that cruise ship, I think that one was not destined for Antarctica, but this season I did see some really large ships like Norwegian Cruise Lines and a couple others uh down in Antarctica. And once you have more than 500 passengers on board, you can't land. Like you can't get off the ship. And so that's something I also like struggle with where it's like I understand that like the accessibility of Antarctica becomes much easier when you're on a ship like that. But I also don't think it's good for Antarctica to have ships with 3,000 people on it come and only do a ship cruise. Like, do you get enough out of that experience that it was worth the impact of coming on a ship that size? But at the same time, it's like, who am I to say that what we're doing is any better? You know, like, yeah, it's only 100 people at a time, but like then there's more ships with that smaller capacity, which compounds the impact. And then we are making landings and doing Zodiac cruises and all this stuff. And so, like, does it pencil out? Like, probably not. I always try to do everything I can to inspire people to take care of Antarctica after they leave Antarctica, but like that's not an obligation of every guide. Like that's my personal obligation as a guide, but like that's not a requirement of these cruises. So, like who am I to say that a 3,000 passenger ship is bad when I'm also on a ship in Antarctica, you know? So it is something I definitely um wrestle with. But just to quickly kind of recap our final trip of the season, because it was also a really good trip. We did get rocked pretty hard in the Drake, but it wasn't like the worst it's ever been on Plancius, but it was also like not fun. And guess we're not on deck as much. We did pass our sister vessel in the fleet for Oceanwide Ortelius, which I worked on last year in March. So it was kind of fun of all the places to run into each other. It was the Drake Passage, and everybody came out and waved, and yeah, it was nice. Again, we went to Danco Island to start our trip for the peninsula. At like 3 o'clock in the morning, I think. The expedition leader woke up the ship and there was a killer whale or a group of killer whales coming in past the the Melchior Islands, I think we were on our way in. And quite a few people got up for that, which was nice. And then when we got to Danco, it was really foggy, but it did this like beautiful dramatic lift and like boom, all of a sudden there was like the mountain behind the ship, and it was really nice. The Gentoo penguins were quite busy on their nests and had lots of eggs, but no chicks yet. And from shore, we did see minke whales and humpback whales. And then in the afternoon, we just popped over to the Orne Islands, and it started to be kind of cold and breezy. It's more exposed out in the Gerlache at that place. But there was chin straps and gentoos, same thing. Lots of eggs, but no chicks yet. And that's another place where I really felt like there were less penguins there this year than there was last year. And this trip that we were on is a base camp trip. So everybody that registers for that trip has an opportunity to try camping, mountaineering, and kayaking. So that night that we did around the Herrera Channel, they camped at Care Point, which is just across from the landing site at Danco Island, and they had Weddell seals on shore and beautiful weather. We got to watch humpback whales while we were kind of transiting away from them while they were camping. And then the next morning, we were back at Portal Point again. Completely different scenery. It was foggy, it was snowing, it was raining, and the sea ice like filled Charlotte Bay around Portal Point. I think it was just breaking off the back of the glacier in the back of Charlotte Bay, but there was just sea ice everywhere. It was kind of hard to navigate with the Zodiacs and the ship, um, but we got it done. And then as we left Portal Point to go over to Foyne Harbor, um, there was this incredible, they were single humpbacks, but they were doing some bubble feeding, feeding at the surface on krill, and then there was huge flocks of fulmars around. It was really cool to see. When we got over to Foyne Harbor, it was not the same as the trip before, which you always have to be, like clean slate every time you go to a place. There were still whales around, but like, there was like 5 whales around instead of 50. But it was still really good. We got to see feeding. We got some really nice close looks. We had really good cruise in the ice. And then when we got over to the shipwreck, so Foyne Harbor is where the shipwreck of the Governor or the Governoren is. It was a Norwegian whaling vessel that ran aground when it had an onboard fire. And this year it's even more sunk than it was last year. And there were some Gentoo penguins like playing around it. And at one point, as I was slowly approaching, they like jumped over the railing of the ship and then jumped back over it. And then they were climbing around on the wreck and stuff too, which was really fun to watch. The next day, we kept going south and across the Gerlache. And we went down to the Newmire Channel and to like the area of Des Moines Point and Port Lockroy. And one of the places where you almost always see killer whales is right there between the Gerlache and the Newmire. So me and the ship doctor got up early because we wanted to look for killer whales. And right as we were about to enter into the Newmire, we saw them. But we couldn't wake up the ship in time to see them before we finished our navigation into the Newmire. But it was good to see them. And it was like, it's always like, haha, I knew I was right. When you're like, oh, we always see them here. So in the morning, we dropped off the mountaineers at Damoy Point, and then the rest of the ship went on a Zodiac cruise. And this is the first time I've done this as a Zodiac cruise. I've done it as a ship cruise, but we went around to the backside by Yelcho Base in the Peltier Channel. So like um where Port Lockroy is and Damoy Point is, there's like several channels that all come together. So the ship came down the Newmire and then around, like finished passing out of the Newmire once we dropped off the mountaineers and swung around to the opening of the Peltier, which also connects back to the Newmire. And we cruised the Peltier from Yelcho Base to Port Lockroy, which was so cool. I love when we do one-way cruises. It's like, ooh, the ship's going to disappear and they're going to get us on the other side. It's always a little like unsettling because you're like, we're going to lose radio contact and like you got to stick to plan A because they're not going to know when you change and all that. But it like obviously we do it when we feel confident that it's safe to do it. And so it was cool to get like dropped off and then sent off on this one-way cruise. And there are some penguin colonies in the Peltier that are part of like the Chilean Antarctic program, ENOC. part of their, or ENAC, their purview. So the ENAC crew was out there and they were doing their survey work with the Gen2s. And so we got to wave hi to them, tell them good morning. Um, we did see a couple Weddell seals off and on. We saw a shag colony, or Antarctic cormorants. But unfortunately, at the end of the cruise, the weather was horrible. It was a really sucky ride back to the ship. I felt really bad for our guests, but they had had some pretty good like weather before. So I was like, oh no, this you're gonna get the Antarctica weather now. So um yeah, everybody was pretty good sports, but they were very wet when they got back to the ship. But in the afternoon, we were able to do the landing at Damoy. We kind of tucked around into Dorian Bay and escaped the wind, and the wind did drop a little, which worked out okay. Again, Damoy's another place where I just really feel like there are less penguins there this year than there were last year. Yeah, I don't know. I I'll have to ask because it just really seemed like less. And Damoy's another place where they did camping. So, moving right along, we had the next morning right there at Port Lockroy, so we didn't have to go anywhere overnight. Beautiful, beautiful, sunny, glassy, calm morning. Total change from the day before. And the first little penguin chicks, the first Gen 2 chicks had hatched within the last 2 days. So we got to see teeny, teeny, tiny Gen 2 chicks while we were at Port Lockroy, which is British Antarctic Base A. It's the Penguin Post Office, so we got to send, our postcards, do a little gift shopping if we wanted, and walk around a historic site where they used to study more of like meteorological stuff and things about the atmosphere, but now they mostly just are there to operate the post office and to study the penguins, and they do a few other things. Um, we saw some Weddell seals. There's almost always Weddell seals there. But we also had a crab eater seal there on shore, which is very weird. I've never seen a crab eater seal on land before. I mean, it happens, but it's just very unusual. They usually are very ice loving species. Um, and then in the afternoon, we left Port Lockroy and we headed back up the Gerlache to Orne Harbor. Amazing conditions. Like, again, afternoon you live for, like a mirror. It was sunny with like dramatic sky, glassy calm. And of course, we went out of the Neumeier into the Gerlache where you typically find killer whales. And we found them. There was quite a big group up against like the glacier on one side of the channel, and the ship was like, yep, we can go over there, we'll go check them out. They were slowly just cruising down the Gerlache in little pockets. Beautiful, made some really nice passes by the ship. And then as everybody kind of trickled back inside and we were trying to do a quick recap with like plans for tomorrow, I radioed the expedition leader. Like, he literally had just said hello on the microphone, and I was like, hey, I was like, I wouldn't interrupt you except for the fact that this group of killer whales is going to swim right by the window while you're talking, like really close. So we had another big group of killer whales like come head on with the ship and go right down the side of the ship. And it was really nice. Really, really good sighting. And then in the afternoon, we had a great landing at Orne Harbor. It's a chinstrap penguin colony. You go up, 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 up. You climb really high up there. And this year, there was a big snowdrift where most of the nests usually are. So a lot of the birds moved further up the slope, so they weren't as easy to see. But it was still really a beautiful day. And it was a really challenging site with the brash ice in front of the landing site because the glacier was very active, pushing off a lot of ice throughout the day and then pushing it across the landing site. That was also the day that we did Fort Lockroy and Orne Harbor was also New Year's Eve. So in the evening, we did a cruise in Wilhelmina Bay to ring in the new year. And we saw humpback whales and gentoo penguins and krill fishing vessels out in the Gerlache, which was a bummer. And Wilhelmina Bay was kind of busy with ships as well. We saw other ships as cruising around as we were having our New Year's Eve party. But it was pretty fun to see the first whales of 2025, like right after midnight. It was an interesting way to ring in the new year, this time down on the peninsula. Last year we were in the Drake. It was not nearly as fun. So to start off New Year's Day, we had a cruise of the Lemaire Channel. It was windy and it was cold, but it was finally ice free. That was actually Flancius's first transit of the Lemaire all season because there had been so much ice in the channel that the ship couldn't get through. We did a landing at Plano Island, which has a Gentoo penguin colony, and it was so rainy. Like it was really weird to see the rainwater just like pool on top of the snow and make everything so slushy. There was actually one area where the pool of water was like turquoise blue because it was on top of the ice and the penguins were swimming around in it. So it was like a little penguin pool party. Um, but I don't think, like as the climate warms and the peninsula warms, like we're gonna have more and more of those rainy days. And I think long term, that's just really not going to be good for Antarctica. And I do think that is the future of Antarctica, is we're going to see more and more rain on the peninsula when we're not supposed to see like hardly any precipitation at all. In the afternoon, we had a really windy and choppy cruise in Port Charcot, which is just on the other side of Plano with this big iceberg graveyard. And we had really cool, like big flocks of Gentoo penguins feeding with humpback whales. And like, it kind of reminded me of like the sea lions with the whales in California, except the penguins are a lot more evasive of the whales. So like the penguins' timing is quite a bit different than the whales, but you could tell they were working on the same patches of krill and they were just circling around the same area. So it was really cool. And the next day we spent all day in Paradise Harbor because that was like the only spot where it wasn't going to be horrendously windy. And so we were able to pull off two really nice Zodiac cruises. In the morning, we stayed more on the side towards Base Brown and Stony Point. We had really good humpback whales. We had seals. We got to see the researchers at Base Brown. They had just arrived. Of course, Gentoo penguins. And then in the afternoon, we pushed over to the other side of Paradise towards the Chilean base and towards Leith Cove. And we had humpback whales again. But then again, we did kind of like a one-way cruise from like Leith Cove to the opening over towards Nico Harbor, like past the Chilean base. And I think it's the Aguirre Channel. And the ship went around the other way out into the Gerlache. So it was another like the ship ditched us cruise, which was cool, but also paid off because when the ship went out into the Gerlache, they saw killer whales and they radioed us and told us. And so some of the boats that were closer to that side went and picked them up. And they just so happened to be coming into Paradise. And it was a huge group. It was like 12 or more. And they were quite social. There was lots of young ones. They were playing with the Zodiacs. Oh, it was just, again, only the third time I've ever had killer whales in the Zodiac. And it was just like a really great encounter. So really, really cool. And then we finished off that evening, headed out to the Bransfield again for our last day at Deception. And there was just so many vessels in general, but also so many krill fishing vessels. We saw Chinese ones, we saw Norwegian ones, we saw vessels being resupplied, we saw vessels actively fishing. It's just really frustrating. Like, what do we need it for? Why do we need to take something so low out of the food chain from one of the most remote places on Earth for anything? What do we like? Why do we need it for anything? There's no local economy that supports. There's no local ecosystem that goes back into. That is all going to fish farms and to fisheries in the northern hemisphere and to krill supplements for the northern hemisphere and like for bait and a few other things in the southern hemisphere, but most of it is not even staying on this side of the equator. Like, what are we doing fishing so low in the food chain? And it's like, I get it. When you look at what are the major impacts of the Antarctic ecosystem, it's climate change, it's fishing, and it's tourism. So, like, someone on the tourism industry saying that krill fishing is bad, I can understand how you're like, that's kind of like, you don't have the ability to call them out like that. But at the same time, I do, because what they're doing to me makes zero sense. Like, it's completely not sustainable to take something that low in the food chain that plays such an important role in that ecosystem and sell it as an oil tablet in the northern hemisphere. Like, IATO, the tour operator organization, is like kind of backed into a corner because of that sentiment about like, well, you can't really push too hard against krill fishing because they'll also say, well, you're having an impact on Antarctica as well. So maybe we're going to review you as well. Like, I think that is a concern. But like the tour operators are upset about it, our guests are upset seeing it. So like IATO's in a harsh position. So what I did at the end of that trip, because we saw so many krill fishing vessels, is I looked up the web page that shows all the Antarctic Treaty members parties, and most of them have the website linked to whoever the government office is that is like the part of the Antarctic Treaty System for that signatory party country. And I made a QR code for people to take pictures of on the TV, and like they could look up their home country if it was a signatory party and then direct to the website to find the right person to talk to, like at the Antarctic Treaty System level instead of the IATO level. Um, to like talk to your politician about what you saw and like what you think about it. Um, but yeah, I'm still like trying to figure out how to talk to people about it and like how to report on it in a way that's like not shoving my idea down other people's um throat, I guess, but impressing on people that it's quite dangerous to fish that low in the food chain, but especially when you have old data, which we have proof that the data they're using to set the quota is not accurate. So trying to like impress the seriousness of the situation without like getting too preachy and turning people off about the subject. But it is something I talk about in my lectures on the ship. And then like seeing it in person was like, oh wow, this is a lot of krill fishing vessels right here in the middle of all of it. And you know, like we saw like 50 whales and then like five krill fishing vessels, and then 2 weeks later there's five whales and still krill fishing vessels. So are they're correlated, but they're not, it's not necessarily a causation thing. And what the krill companies are doing is not illegal. That's the biggest problem. It's not illegal. So, yeah, still trying to figure out what to do there. Just to wrap up the Antarctic trips overall, like last day at telephone, it was windy and foggy, but you know, we did the landing. Again, saw a crab eater seal on shore there. There was a Weddell seal and a crab eater seal. Still weird. It looked like a young crab eater seal, so maybe it's not that weird. I don't know. The northbound Drake was pretty rolly, kind of quiet for wildlife until we got close to the Beagle Channel. We had dusky dolphins in the Beagle again. So overall, short and sweet season, but man, it was, yeah, it was so good. I didn't want to leave. I'll be back. Yeah, amazing. And just like coming home to the US in January, wow. Wild. 2025 is wild here in the United States. So between feeling like fired up about the krill fishing thing, but also just fired up about a lot of things happening in the US right now, just trying to like get my brain around what the heck is happening at all different levels of our government, and especially the environmental protections that are being rolled back, and you know, further weakening of our efforts to take care of our land, water, and air. Um, yeah, I look to some of the people that I think are like doing good work in that area and like are kind of heroes of mine, like Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She just put out another book that is also fabulous called What If We Get It Right? Talking about climate solutions. And she wrote a piece for Rolling Stone this week. And just some things that I like kind of distilled out of what she wrote, that I'm trying to figure out how to put into practice is like, you know, join like things that are happening on the federal government level are so big and so chaotic, but you can always join a local environmental group. You can always find a home and a community for your planet protecting and life sustaining work, and you need to be prepared to settle in for the long haul. And in her Rolling Stone article, she also quotes Bill McKibben, who's also a climate journalist and activist. And he said, faced with the kind of crises that we face, the most important thing that an individual can do is not always be an individual. So Ayana kind of unpacks that a little bit. And she says, more of us need to find ways to speak with a collective, coordinated voice. If that's at city council meetings, planning board meetings, utility commission meetings, and support local climate candidates, like be vocal about supporting local climate candidates. And so, like when it feels like it's all spiraling out of your control and it's too big, do something meaningful close to home and build a community with people that are doing the same thing. Even if it's cleaning up your local park with a group of people that are passionate about that local park. Find something where you can settle in to do the work that moves something forward for your local community, whether it's advocating on the legal side or the political side, doing service, you know, raising awareness about issues like, and in some ways, like even on the election scale, like what affects your day-to-day life, like your utilities, your access to water. A lot of it starts with your local election first before it gets into the whole mess of the federal government, which is a mess. But like your county and your city and your state elections also matter just as much or more than the big elections every 2 to 4 years for members of Congress and for the president. Because the people in your local area are the people that are going to see the first court cases. They're going to go through their courts first before they escalate to a higher court. Those are people that are going to, designate the park or coordinate, funding for the park or whatever it is, your local waterway. Some of them affect your utility bills, the way your harbor functions. And so, Ayanna, Elizabeth Johnson, and others are saying, like find a community and build a community in that. And then also like environmental justice and climate justice is social justice. Like it's all connected. And so no one can do everything, right? But we can all do something. And at this point, especially in the US, like we all have to do something. Like we can't just sit around and do nothing and watch in horror. Like we've got to do something. And so yeah, I guess that's my kind of my call to action and also like my pep talk from people that are far more qualified to talk about it than me. Um, so yeah, hang in there. Thanks for listening. Thanks for making it this far. This episode's really long, and I'm excited to have a guest on for the next episode and looking forward to talking about more fun wildlife and whale things in 2025. So, see you on the next one. Bye.